this week on the BackTable podcast.
And so this is what's most inspiring. Like I can handle, the stresses of running a company, and all the financial considerations and people considerations and, business considerations and everything else. Like having a human life in my hands is something that I would very much struggle with. And I have a tremendous amount of respect and I'm inspired by, the doctors who we can only help to, help support them in building up their confidence and skills. But ultimately, I can't do what they do. So that's really where I derive a lot of the inspiration.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BackTable Innovation Podcast. You can find all of our previous episodes of our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and on BackTable.com. This is our next installment in the BackTable Innovation Show, where you'll hear stories from founders and physician entrepreneurs who are helping to drive healthcare forward through medtech innovation. I'm your guest host, Eric Gantwerker. I'm a physician, pediatric otolaryngologist with special interests in technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And I'm very excited to introduce my special guest and very good longtime friend and colleague, Sam Glassenberg, CEO of LevelX. Welcome, Sam.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of, your journey to where you're at today. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of how you got here and some of the bumps in the road, and also focus on some of the advice that you have for others. Let's start with sort of, what was sort of the origin of LevelX and sort of what was leading up to sort of the starting of LevelX?
Sure. Well, LevelX was founded by accident. I think you'll find the LevelX story is very different from many, many founding stories in healthcare. So my background is not in medicine. I am not a physician entrepreneur. I'm not even a physician. I've spent my career in the video games industry. I started out at LucasArts making Star Wars games as an animator. I used to lead the DirectX graphics team at Microsoft, where basically my job was to figure out how to make video games look real. After that, I ran one of the leading independent mobile video game studios in Hollywood that made games for Hunger Games, Mission Impossible, Rocky, and so forth. But basically this successful career in the video games industry made me the disgrace of my family because, well, I come from a family of doctors. My grandfather was a famous doctor. My parents are both doctors, as you know. My wife is a doctor, aunts, uncles. I'm the moron who never went to medical school. I have terrible stories about this. I don't know. Should we talk about what happened with the Emmy?
I think we should. I mean, why not?
Okay.
I mean, I think it's interesting.
I think it provides good perspective on sort of my background. I mean, you know my parents, so this is very believable.
Of course.
So in 2006, I accepted a technical Emmy on behalf of my team at Microsoft for pushing the cutting edge of interactive entertainment. It's not the Emmys they show. It's not the ones they show on TV. It's when they do this one afterwards, but it's the same statue and there's still a red carpet. You dress nice. And so I call home to let my parents know, hey, I'm about to go and accept an Emmy. And my father, without skipping a beat, he had no idea this was coming because this hadn't been announced yet, goes, Sam, that's very nice. But in this family, we only recognize Nobel Prizes. He goes, you're not yet 30 years old. You can still go to medical school. I'll pay for it.
The good Dr. Glassenberg.
The good Dr. Glassenberg. And so this story is 100% true. This is exactly the kind of thing he would say.
I can actually see his face in my mind when he said that too.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't. I was on the phone, but we can all picture it.
But I can picture it.
And so all of this comes to a head in 2012 when my dad, so he's an anesthesiologist here at Northwestern. He goes, all right, Sam, you're too old. You're not going to med school. So at least put all this gaming nonsense to good use. Make me a game to train my colleagues to do a fiber optic intubation. I mean, you know fiber optic intubation better than anybody. It's a tricky procedure. He goes, we only, do this on rare, difficult patients. It's a very visual procedure. So just make me a game that, I can use to train people on their phones. I don't want to drag anyone to the sim center. Now, I'm actually running a Hollywood game company at the time. So it's not like my free time is abundant. So I sit down for basically 3 weekends and out of guilt, I throw together a crappy little game for my father that I upload to the App Store because I'm basically too busy to install it on his friends' iPhones one by one. So here's the link. They can download it. Leave me alone. I don't think about it for 2 years. In 2014, he calls me. He goes, hey, Sam, how many people downloaded the thing? I go, well, I don't know how many of your friends downloaded your app, Dad, but I can check for you. I went and I looked, and we had 100,000 doctors, nurses, and airway specialists worldwide who'd been playing this thing. I think I had created like one of the most popular medical training simulators ever. At which point I'm like, why is this happening? I Google it and I discover, unbeknownst to me, they've been doing efficacy studies on this crappy little game I made for my father that shows it's improving physician performance. And they're running these at, medical schools all over the world. And that's the moment where I realized, ooh, this is interesting. Clearly there's, demand for something like this. And that was the motivation for starting Level X. What if we actually put together a team of top video game developers, designers, artists from across the industry, and instead of throwing something together out of guilt, actually sat down with hundreds of physician advisors and contributors, experts from, every specialty to capture the challenges of the practice of medicine using video games.
So I want to probe a little bit deeper on that, because obviously there's a lot of people that get ideas about innovation and ways that they can better different industries. You're coming from the games industry, you sort of dipped a toe into this medical industry and you're sort of in that deep end of the pool. But it's different because you were CEO of a game studio that was making mobile Hollywood games. How did you sort of decide, what, I'm going to move away from this. I'm going to give this up to jump to this other thing. What was that moment like that you actually made that decision?
So I'm trying to think if it was a particular moment. I mean, essentially, so to provide some more detail, in 2014, that's when I realized this huge audience that I had rallied. But I basically sat on that for, close to 2 years. Like I was busy running a Hollywood-based game company. So that company was successfully acquired by like a major international gaming company out of Europe. And so post-acquisition, I started looking into it. I was like, all right, what should I do with this? I really didn't have much, I wasn't really sure what the business plan would be or whether this would be the next thing. But it was always sort of bothering me because I had clearly there was demand for something like this. The question is sort of how do you turn that into a business? I didn't like the idea. I kind of felt that one of the reasons why this game I had made for my dad was so successful was because I didn't follow the standard business model for like medical simulation or education, right? Of we're going to go and load this up into a giant $250,000 box and sell it to, the 200 sim centers in the country. Like the whole value was it was available for free on your phone. And the question becomes, okay, then where's the business model here? And what I started doing is I started learning more about, basically like the physician education and marketing ecosystem, learning basically like all these, medical conferences and whatnot, the degree to which, they are supported and funded by the sponsorship in the expo hall. And I really sort of learned more and more about the physician marketing, physician education business and realized, wow, you know what, there's actually, I started running the numbers and, actually using sort of the equations that we had from free to play games, but using the inputs from healthcare marketing and healthcare education and realized, wait a minute, even though the audience is 2 orders of magnitude smaller, right? Because that physician's time is so valuable, the numbers actually work out and you can create a business where you're delivering content for free to doctors and it's sponsored by industry.
Exactly. And you talked about the sort of free to play or freemium model that is from video games. And really that model is really predicated on the idea that you have, whales or people who sort of fund the other things. And it's more of a subscription based model. So how did you sort of figure out, okay, this shouldn't be a subscription based, this should be something more funded from industry? Because that's a really big decision that sort of goes against what's been in the industry and what has been the standard.
So I would love to say that this, came from some genius, idea, but really I was lucky. And then it just so happened I wasn't just making free to play games before this. I was making free to play games based on Hollywood movies. And that is what made the connection. So if you think about, one of the challenges we've always had in the games industry is we want to be able to bring games to the largest audience. And we want to make, ideally, the more fun the game is, the more money you make, right? That is the ideal business model in the games industry, is one where the more you play, the more money is made, because then the incentives are aligned. The problem is we've never really had that since, we were inserting coins into an arcade machine, right? If somebody goes and buys a game for $50, it doesn't matter like if they play for an hour or play for 300 hours, they're spending the same amount of money. And the other problem is also that they got to pay $50 to play your game, right? Whether or not they actually like it. So there was a model that was developed and actually started in Asia and then eventually made its way to sort of, this is the primary business model in games now, which is free to play. The game itself is free. You can continue to play the game for free, but like as you play, there are opportunities to spend money to, improve your game experience. And this is what we call free to play. And at the very beginning, we were very excited about this in the games industry because it all of a sudden created this amazing opportunity. Anybody can now play your game. And theoretically, the more people play, the more money you're going to make. In reality, it didn't work out that way. So what ended up happening was, you described like whales. What ended up happening was 95% of your audience wouldn't spend money. And so basically what was happening is 100% of your revenue came from 5% of your audience. This is like a known problem in free to play games. But even worse, something like 60% of the revenue came from 0.3% of the audience. What they realized was these games were able to make money because a small percentage of the audience would be willing to spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in a game. This is where the term whales comes from. This is very problematic because now what happens is the incentives are no longer aligned. Instead of trying to make a game that's fun for everybody, what free-to-play games started becoming was this, I contorted the game design where you were trying to find the people, that 0.1%, that was willing to spend crazy money. You're trying to find the whales basically and get as much money out of them as you could. And so it really meant that you were creating a game for whales, and then everyone else became cannon fodder and spam bots, as you might remember sort of from the Farm Bull days. The promise was, though, there was a business model that worked, and that was advertising, right? If you could have a game that was filled with advertising, what that meant was the more somebody played, the more money you could make. But ads in games, like the actual value of an in-game ad was so low that companies that offered advertising in their game and in-app purchase, 99% of the revenue would come from in-app purchase because the advertisers were spending so little. The exception was Hollywood-based games because their brands like Coca-Cola and Subway and things like that would spend a premium to have their advertising in the Hunger Games game or the Mission Impossible game. And so I had familiarity with a business model where you could actually, make double-digit percentages of your revenue from advertising. And that led me to realize, hey, wait a minute, in healthcare, because of the dynamics, the business dynamics, you could actually make a successful game for doctors that was monetized exclusively through advertising. And that means you can achieve the ultimate dream of the games industry, which is to create games where the more people play, the more money you make, but you don't have to charge them directly.
And that's the secret sauce. That's sort of where all the magic happens, is because then you can really focus on the player community to make something really interesting and fun and really try to focus on creating that environment so that other people can derive benefit from it.
Exactly. The more fun it is, the more money, exactly. The more fun it is, the more revenue it generates. And therefore, the more content you can create. Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to dive in a little bit deeper because, obviously your training comes from engineering and games and computer science, and you got a master's. I want to know where did your entrepreneur DNA come from? What happened in your life that made you think, you know what, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to create a company? Because you obviously, even before you were CEO of the other games company, you did not have an exec position, right? You came into that as CEO, but you had director position. So what sort of led to that entrepreneur DNA, that willingness to take that risk and be a visionary?
Well, you flatter me with the visionary stuff, but yeah. So look, I've been very, very lucky in my career to be able to sort of have a lot of experiences that have been very formative. All right. So I start out, right. So my background's engineering, right? That's what I studied at an undergrad and grad, but my hobby had always been animation. I don't remember back in high school, like this is like in the mid 90s, I was making, the Golem and, all sorts of like animated videos. Did you ever star in any of them? Did you ever do the voiceover on any of the ones I did?
I don't think I ever did.
Okay.
I should have.
No, because you have a great radio voice.
Oh, thank you. See, now you're buttering me up.
Yeah. So I did animation as a hobby, and it just so happened that like I put together a reel and I applied in Lucasfilm, actually in the film division. I wanted to work in feature film, and I didn't get a job in the film division. I got a job in the video games division, which is very fortuitous because I learned actually they were doing much more interesting things in video games than film. But I was hired as an artist. So here I am, entry level. And very early in my career, working with some of the most talented artists in the industry, which was great because it helped me realize that no matter how much I invested in my art, I was never going to be as talented as they were.
That's how I feel about your surgery.
Uh-oh.
No matter how many times I do it, I'm not going to be as good as them.
Oh dear. And so I was working with all these talented artists and I'm like, okay, I'm realizing like, wait, my career is not art, but I'm an engineer. And as I do this, I'm discovering there are all these things that the artists want to be able to achieve in the game that they can't because of the technical constraints, either the capabilities of what the time PlayStation 2 or original Xbox hardware, or the tools that they're using to create the content. Oh, I want to be able to have a level where, you fly around the planet, but the planet's actually an asteroid, so you can go all the way around. Or I want to be able to bake very realistic shadows to create a certain look in this scene. And they just couldn't do it. And I was an engineer. So I was like, oh, great, I can solve these problems for you. And that's where I found my calling, which is my role in life here is not to go and be the best artist, because I'm not. But what I can do is I know art just well enough that I can make sure that technology doesn't get in the way of an artist's creative vision. And that really sort of defined what I did at Lucas. It defined what I did at Microsoft, where I was basically figuring out, all right, what is the capabilities and the tools that the hardware needs in order to enable artists, game designers, game artists, enable them to create a vision of the game they want to be able to build, and that they are not limited by what the hardware can do. But eventually, sort of as I sort of expanded beyond that, I realized it actually, so at Microsoft, I sort of moved up in management and I was sort of managing teams. And I started realizing like, actually, it's not just about making sure the technology doesn't get in the way of the artist's creative vision. It's about making sure that the business doesn't get in the way of the artist's creative vision. That's where I made my first foray into entrepreneurship, which I should also qualify. I was not a founder of the Hollywood-based games company. I was a hired CEO. So I was brought in to run the company. The founders had done a lot of the hard work up front to like raise the first round of capital and everything else. And I was able to come in and sort of build that entrepreneurial experience on the job after others had, done a lot of the legwork, sort of the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
Right, exactly. So one thing that you sort of mentioned was that you sort of came into that CEO position, them having done a lot of the things with regards to investing. I want to sort of zero in on some of those skill sets that you felt you had versus those that you felt you didn't have, and how you educated yourself with how to even start a business, how to do startup. Everything I learned about the company, about Level X, as we started, was me watching Silicon Valley on HBO. So that's really sort of where my education came from. So how did you know some of that financial aspects of starting a company from the ground up?
Sure. So actually, the Hollywood-based game company, I was involved from the beginning, but I was involved in helping them raise money as a third-party independent. Like I was at Microsoft at the time. And one of the things I was doing was advising startups in gaming. And, so one of the companies that I was advising, like they were like, hey, can you go talk to our investors to almost provide due diligence, right? To basically explain why this is relevant, why there's market need. And I was like, sure, no problem. I went and did that. And that sort of gave me a view into how investors think and what they're trying to achieve. And so, I then went through the process of learning the finances of, how fundraising works and how to run a startup. That I learned on the job as a CEO of an early stage startup. And then I was able to sort of use all of that, all of those skills I had developed on somebody else's dime, basically, when I went out to go found my own company. And, to be honest, like learned to avoid making a lot of the mistakes that I made the first time around, when I went and founded, after the first company was successfully acquired, then the second time around, I was like, great, now we can do it without making some of those mistakes in the company where I'm the founder.
Right, exactly. So take me back to that time where you decide, I'm going to start this company. What does day one look like? What did you do that first day to get yourself oriented and get yourself started? And who did you talk to? Who did you get advice from?
Yeah, so I don't feel like there really is a day one. Maybe for some companies, there's a day. I mean, there's the official day the company is founded, but that usually follows all sorts of negotiations and pitch decks and everything else. It started with conversations. It started with, through my network, having conversations with people, doing research. We're very lucky in Chicago. So Level X has been called the deep dish hot dog of Chicago high tech because Level X has this the video games industry basically started in Chicago. And so Chicago has always had like a very strong games industry pedigree, but obviously the healthcare system here is incredible. We've got pharma companies, med device companies, major teaching hospitals. All the major medical conferences are here at McCormick Place. So
Yeah,
it's just like
all the
this,
medical societies, all of them are all in Chicago.
exactly. It's like amazing medical ecosystem here in Chicago. And so it meant this, there were lots of people to talk to. So I set up shop. Chicago actually had a very good healthcare focused incubator space called Matter. I'm usually pretty negative on incubators, but this one was actually really well done. And so I set up, just got a table there, started taking meetings, started putting together a business plan, started putting together, and then actually networked both through the healthcare side. So like if you think about the seed investors in Level X, some actually were Chicago. So Pritzker Group Venture Capital, for example, was a leading Chicago-based venture fund that I was actually introduced to through the incubator. But on the other side, the lead investor in the seed round was Jazz Venture Partners, which is a really interesting venture fund. Their whole thesis is around, like they've invested in all the like early, like leading digital therapeutics companies. It's sort of the intersection of games and neuroscience and healthcare. And so their partnership was based of like executives from the games industry, as well as like successful executives from healthcare and med device, and they were working together. And so I actually knew one of the partners from the games industry
Oh, funny.
as they were starting that fund. And so it's sort of through a combination of games industry networking and, Chicago-based healthcare ecosystem networking, put together the plan, raised the seed round of funding, and then, it all sort of accelerated from there. Very quickly, we were too big for the incubator and too noisy because we were a bunch of game developers. So they asked us kindly to graduate. I'm doing air quotes here, graduate.
Take your Diet Dr. Pepper somewhere else.
Exactly. And loud, and boisterous, engineering and art. And we moved to our first office and then started building our first product and then, continued to grow and grow the company until now we're, 130 people. We've been successfully acquired. We have over 750,000 medical professionals have been playing our games on mobile.
So, talking to other innovators and entrepreneurs, everything seems like everything sort of falls into place. And, it's like one step to the next step to the next step. And in retrospect, everything seems like it just fell into place. I'm guessing that's not what the case was. So can you talk about some of the failures, some of the setbacks? If there's any point in time where you're just like, I'm not sure if this is going to work, take me back to those moments.
Oh my goodness. Ooh, there are many. Yeah. Anyone who tries to paint a picture as like it, of entrepreneurship is just hopping from success to success.
Yeah. Everybody just like, you see them at the end and they're like, I just got here, it just happened.
Yeah, no. In fact, I mean, some of the best stories are actually from the Hollywood-based game company. So, I joined that company in 2008, like 6 months before the world economy went to hell.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So like I left this sort of comfortable job at Microsoft to go run a early stage gaming startup, actually, that had no product yet, was pre-product, pre-revenue, and was actually started in Israel, which is a country that didn't have much of a games industry back then. Now with the games industry there, it's huge. And so, my first foray was, trying to raise a round of capital, during the worst economic crisis in 50 years, which I think was the most fun I never want to have again.
I was going to say selling ice to Eskimos.
Yeah, it's something like that. I mean, there was all sorts of just crazy challenges. I remember I pivoted the company to start, the company was actually building games based on its own IP. And then during the economic crisis, I pivoted the company to work with third-party IP, which ultimately ended up, resulting in its success, in successful growth, but in finding its niche. But at the beginning, that was actually really tricky. So I remember like we were looking, we really found our niche in Hollywood movies. But before that, I was doing deals with, game publishers and music labels. And I remembered like, 2008, 2009, like I remember doing a deal with Atari and then they went like bankrupt a few weeks later. Or I remember closing a deal with like a major music label to build a game around one of their leading rappers. Like this was like during the days when like, Rock Band was big and they were doing a lot of games based on famous bands. We closed this big deal. And then literally the next day, the rapper went to jail on drug charges. And like all of like that entire deal just got scrapped because like there was no creative approvals. There was nothing. The whole thing, like 9 months of work down the tubes. So there's all these, it's always a crazy roller coaster.
That's insane. Did you ever have that moment where you're like, I don't know if this is going to work, or were you pretty confident going into starting Level X and the precursor for Level X, I guess?
Right. So I say like, there's always the question of, is it going to make it? There's never the question of, is it going to work? I've been very lucky that like, the two examples of companies I've run, like the product market fit is extremely abundantly clear. The need is acute. The opportunity is big. And if there is any competition, we have a big leg up on it, right? So it's usually not like, will it work? The question is, will it work in time, right? Given all the macroeconomic factors, given, all the things that can go wrong. Oh yeah, your number one commercial deal that's like driving the revenue for the company. Oh, that partner just went bankrupt. That rapper just went to jail, right? Like these are the kinds of things where it's like, oh, wait a minute. These are the things that break companies. In fact, we often see this, right? Companies that have great ideas and, great concepts often don't make it because of bad timing or, bad macroeconomic circumstances. And sure enough, a few years later, somebody comes in and does it. Right. And I kind of feel that way with both of these companies that like, movie-based free-to-play games on mobile and social were an inevitability. Same thing with, games becoming the accepted mode, and a major accepted modality of medical education and training. Like these are things that I feel are inevitable.
Absolutely. I think, there's tremendous successes, but recognizing sort of the right time and the right moment is so imperative for everybody that I've talked to. Talk to me a little bit about some of the blind areas, areas that you felt like, my skill set's really not great here, and how you sort of identified people to fill those gaps, where you sought education in those areas. You talked a little bit about it earlier, sort of finding out about the medical education space and lifelong learning space. But tell me a little bit more about sort of how you organize the principles of the company.
Right. So, right. I did not have experience in medical education outside of my accidental successes. So I hired Dr. Eric Gantwerker, who is an expert in medical education. Problem solved.
Problem solved.
Oh, you want a more complete answer?
Yeah. Well, other people besides me. Yeah. I didn't fill all the gaps, but I appreciate it.
Right. So, honestly, one of the things that concerned me about going from entertainment into healthcare was that I would turn around a corner and there would be some, unforeseen regulatory constraint or other constraint that I hadn't anticipated because I didn't know the market well enough that would cripple my business, right? That would hold me back from releasing something for years or would prevent me from reaching the market. Instead, the opposite has been true. Every corner that we turn at Level X, instead, what happens is we discover a new opportunity that we didn't know existed, or at least that I didn't know existed. You probably knew a number of these existed, but I didn't know, right? Some huge opportunity we didn't know existed that is some acute problem in healthcare, and games basically has a solution to it, which is, the best solution out there. And Level X is the best position to go and pursue that opportunity. And, we just keep discovering these the more we do this. And so that's sort of been the story. And the way we've done that is by hiring people that, Level X is this melting pot of the game designers and artists and engineers who worked on everything from Call of Duty to Words with Friends, working with not just fantastic medical advisors, surgeons, physicians, and contributors, but also experts from healthcare and digital health, folks who've worked at, Doximity and Medscape and various agencies and, have worked throughout the healthcare ecosystem, worked at life science companies, med device companies. They're all working together, like pulling in solutions from all these different disciplines.
Yeah, it's so key. They always say load the bus with the right people and then figure out where it's going. I want to talk a little bit about competition.
I think maybe the bad analogy with Level X, the bus was already going because we had already shown, like we were lucky, right? Lots of companies come up with an idea and then they spend years trying to get traction, especially in healthcare, right? You come up with an idea and usually out of some tragic story. And then, oh my gosh, I was watching my patient suffer, something horrible happened to a loved one. And then you come up with an idea, you're like, I think I can solve this. And then for years, it's trying to get traction. It's trying to get clinical studies. It's trying to get the engineering to work, manufacturing, trying to get some traction in the market. With Level X, it was almost reversed. We had the traction before we built the company, right? I built this game, as a favor to my father, and we had 100,000 medical professionals playing it, right? The traction came first. The demand came first. Then it was, all right, wait a minute. The bus is gone. Let's now bring on the right people onto it to take it in the right direction.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost serendipitous that you did that, because I don't think the Level X would have been founded without that sort of happenstance, right? I mean, that's really, you sort of got this test of the market, this litmus test before you ever even started the company.
Exactly. And so you have lots of entrepreneurs that are very like, I did this. This was all me. I played my part, but a lot of this was luck. I happened to have had this gaming background and come from a family of doctors. And the last company I did happen to be doing free to play games with a advertising based business model, because it was the one genre within games that could support it. And so all these, this and a number of other factors came together that resulted in, Level X's success and contributed to Level X's success.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that as Level X has scaled, tremendously quickly, almost logarithmic over the last 5, 6 years, there's lots of competition that's sort of come in and Level X is unique in the sense that it has different types of competitors. It's not like one competition space. It's not like you're making rebar and there's one other company that makes rebar. You're trying to engage physicians. You're trying to leverage different societies, organizations, hospitals, and industry to help fund these. There's the whole CME space. People who started Google didn't say, well, there's already Alta Vista and web crawler. I'm not going to make another one. So, can you tell me about what is your outlook on competition? How does that sort of drive what you create, drive your vision? Does it affect you at all? Or do you sort of just continue to move forward?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is very much greenfield. Look, my last company doing games for Hollywood movies. One of the main reasons you make games based on Hollywood movies is because the market is so competitive. Hundreds of high quality games launching in the App Store every week, not to mention every other platform. There's really nobody doing what we're doing at Level X. Who else? No, I mean, just practically speaking, there's nobody else that would allow a trainer and a surgeon to do surgery together over Zoom or MS Teams. That technology does not exist anywhere else. The only other place that technology exists is in cloud gaming. It's, again, the entertainment industry. It doesn't exist in healthcare except at Level X. Nobody else has, computational fluid dynamics running on an iPhone or, simulating X-ray and ultrasound, on a phone or in the cloud. Nobody's doing this. So the competition is it's not competition that drives me every morning. It's waking up and realizing all the unrealized opportunity that we're just really scratching the surface of what's possible. And when I say we welcome competition, I say that in the most genuine way. I was giving a talk at the Games for Change conference earlier this summer. It's probably the 800 people were attending live. These are the people that would theoretically build the competition. And it was, hey, everybody, the whole thesis was the need is great in healthcare. The way I think about what Level X is doing is we are creating a genre of medical games. And one of the characteristics of a genre is that there is not one studio, not one game company making games in that genre, but there is an ecosystem of games in that genre. As proud as I am about being the flagship of that genre, my hope is that Level X will actually be the flagship the spark that creates an ecosystem of games, because throughout the healthcare ecosystem and beyond to help professionals, because we cannot do it ourselves. There are too many problems to solve. And if you look at this is more sort of how the games industry thinks of itself. Sure, people are fighting for attention of players, but we took you to a game developer conference, right? After everyone launches their game, everyone is getting up there in front of thousands of people, including their competitor game studios, and in detail, walking them through how they made the game, what mistakes they made, and how they would do it differently next time. Because there's this sense that we're all in this together, and we're all trying to move our industry forward, and we're all trying to make a better experience for our users. And I kind of feel like that's some of the best aspects of the games industry culture that we're bringing over.
And I think one day I asked you, I don't know if you remember this, I asked you what success looks like. And you told me that success looks like having a bunch of competitors in this space. And it was an interesting anecdote that I didn't necessarily think that's what would success look like. And then I went to GDC and I saw those talks. So just watching SIGGRAPH and watching all of our game developers and Itai and all of them showing this is how I did this. They're showing Houdini and all these technologies and how I did this in Maya and Substance P and all this stuff. And it was so interesting to me because competition is the greatest success story. If you've created a genre and you have people coming with you who want to join in and you are forging ahead, that is a success of what you've done.
Correct. And don't worry, we'll continue to maintain a competitive advantage. Having been here first, all right, we have a head start on some of the harder problems. We have a, existing audience, reputation, credibility, all these things. What that means is we're going to be able to focus on a certain set of problems. Others will focus on the rest. Like, I think that's a good thing. And when I look at, the potential of games, game technology and the, cognitive neuroscience based design of games to achieve good in the world, in healthcare and otherwise, like the sky's the limit. And we are lightly scratching the surface at Level X.
Absolutely. We didn't get to talk too much about some of the other technologies like extended reality, virtual reality and such. I wanted to know, besides sort of VR and all the hype and everything that's around it, what are you most excited about in this space? What are you excited to see? What talks do you go to at SIGGRAPH? What talks do you go at GDC? If you went to a healthcare conference that's about innovation, games for health, all those things, what excites you?
Well, I'm a suit now, so I don't really get to go to talks.
Let's pretend you don't have 100 meetings when you go. If you were let free.
I'm lucky if I get out of the hotel lobby.
That's
to
true.
Actually like out of the meeting space. Usually what I do, in fact, it means I really actually have to pick, because now when I go to conferences, there's usually like 2 or 3 talks, if I'm lucky, that I can get to, and I have to like reserve it on my calendar. And so look, for me, I'm very into, my personal interest is in recreating reality. Again, it's like that theme we talked about at the beginning. How do we create platforms and technologies where an artist can envision any world or experience they want to create, and they can create that at scale? That's what excites me. So that's why I really, like, personally, I'm very technically interested in talks about real-time simulation of fluids and various materials and how to make them look realistic and behave realistically. These are things that I'm very excited about. I'm excited about the future of headsets. I do think they're overhyped, certainly to a degree. We've seen lots of really bad examples of how not to use headset-based experiences, especially in healthcare. But I do think that they hold a lot of promise in the future.
Absolutely. And you and I have talked about XR in general, and sort of the realization hasn't happened yet. We're still going through that hype cycle, and we still haven't hit the trough of disillusionment just yet. But I think we're getting very close to starting to realize where actually XR actually can be a value add, especially in medical education, surgical education. And you're right, the head-mounted displays, we talk about cognitive load in education, about how much overwhelming of your senses it is in order for you to really focus on the educational content. And I still think we're working towards that. We're not there quite yet. And then obviously haptics. You and I have talked a lot about haptics and sort of, when will haptics make its entrance into sort of these software-based solutions? I want to talk, we only have a few more minutes. Who inspires you? One of the things on this show is, bringing on physicians and other entrepreneurs who are interesting in this technology and innovation space. Who do you follow? Who inspires you? And who should we have on this show? Who do you recommend?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So in terms of who inspires me, like, I'm actually most inspired by the doctors that we work with and that we serve. In as much as I did not go into medicine, that was simply sort of due to my own apprehensions. And, from my grandfather, who inspires me? Like my grandfather, right? Who was a physician who, served in Italy in World War II, and, went on to like found Manitoba Medical Journal, and, was instrumental in all these efforts in healthcare. Like, these are, and, would carries, black bag through rural Saskatchewan.
Is that the black bag that's in your office?
That is the black bag that's in my office.
Oh
yeah.
my God, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a rare artifact. And so this is what's most inspiring. Like, I can handle, the stresses of running a company, and all the financial considerations and people considerations and, business considerations and everything else. Like, having a human life in my hands is something that I would very much struggle with. And I have a tremendous amount of respect, and I'm inspired by, the doctors who we can only help to, help support them in building up their confidence and skills. But ultimately, like, I can't do what they do. So that's really where I derive a lot of the inspiration.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we are starting to see in healthcare, especially amongst physicians, interest in doing things outside clinical practice. We're seeing, people who are doing these white coat investors, and they're doing real estate, they're doing venture capital. We have Angel MD and MD Angels, but also this technology space is really starting to fill up with physician entrepreneurs, because there is that interest in sort of have this sort of ethos that we're trying to bring to these other spaces. And it's a really interesting movement that we've seen over the last, couple decades.
So on that note, actually, so we mentioned that, like, I mentioned earlier that, like, I wasn't that into incubators, but we joined one called Matter in Chicago. And one of the reasons, like, I'm often asked, like, oh, should I join an incubator if I'm trying to found a company? And my answer is as follows. So, have you ever been to a gymboree?
Yes, unfortunately.
You've been to a gymboree. Okay, so yeah. So like if you haven't been to a gymboree, before you go and evaluate an incubator, go to the gymboree. Now you can't just go to a gymboree because you know what a gymboree is. It's basically it's a suburban basement filled with toys, but they have it in a city.
Right.
So the kids can go and play. You can't just go to a gymboree by yourself. That's weird. Bring your nephew or nieces, and then you can go to the gymboree and you can see them run around and like play, look, I'm a fireman, and like play with all the toys. If you go then next to the incubator and the incubator feels like a gymboree, you should leave. Like, look, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm taking a class in programming, and there's lots of bright colors, and
there's crayons and
there's pool tables and dartboards, and like the sort of like stereotypical what the world thinks startup life is, but really isn't. You walk away. You walk away from the gymboree. One of the reasons why I was so enamored by Matter is I walked in and it was very professional. There was no gymboree. It looked like it was very professional, it was very medical. And the people there were not a bunch of like 20 somethings who couldn't get a job. And therefore, their parents rented a desk for them at the local gymboree incubator for them to come up with their quote unquote great company idea. But instead they were doctors. Like a lot of the people there were doctors who, hey, like I'm in the ER 3 days a week, but I have this idea for a company. And so I spend my Fridays here and, helping to develop that. I think like I have a tremendous amount of respect for physician entrepreneurs. That's one of the reasons why I joined the incubator that we did, which ended up, really helping the company grow early on.
Yeah, I'm tremendously inspired by those physician healthcare entrepreneurs. It's unbelievable to start to bring those skill sets into this other arena that we're really starting to see just the tip of. Last question is, who would you have on the show? If you were the host, what are some names of folks that we maybe or try to reach out to?
I mean, if you could get Stefan Vilsmeyer from Brain Lab.
I would love to get Stefan.
He has some fascinating founding stories of that company.
Yeah. Can you mention really quick, what's Stefan's background? So,
I mean, in the early 80s, he was basically like a wunderkind. Like he published, he was like a mostly self-taught programmer, taught himself computer graphics, published a book about computer graphics that ended up being a bestseller in Germany, and then went on, looked at all this technology early, we're talking very, very early computer graphics, what it looked like in the 80s, right? How to draw lines to a screen was hard. And he was looking at that and saying like, he looked at healthcare and he looked at like, how doctors were still looking at, MRIs and looking at things on film, being like, wait a minute, hold on, we should be able to digitize this, and started building himself the first tools for, digitally exploring 3D volumetric data back, now Level X is figuring out how to do this stuff, doing this stuff on a phone, but back then the highest end computers couldn't handle it. And so, he founded this company that now, 30 years later is driving the cutting edge of not only neurosurgery, but expanding into, almost every other surgical specialty, with all sorts of crazy, trajectory planning tools and imaging modalities and, AR technologies, headset technologies. It's fascinating.
And he's just brilliant. I mean, he's just talk about visionary and savant. Like that's basically Stefan,
If you want visionary, right? I can't guarantee you visionary. He can.
Yes, exactly. Well, awesome. Well, Sam, I can't thank you enough. This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope everything in the future that we help create that genre, and we have lots and lots of competitors in this space.
Agreed. Likewise, this was a lot of fun, and thanks again.